Michael Sattler, how are you doing today?
I am doing great, David. How are you?
Good, thank you. Are you in the Boston area right now?
I am just outside of downtown Boston in a little town called Belmont, which is right
Okay.
outside of Harvard Square. I'm about 10 minutes away.
You kind of look like you could be a radio personality, and you got the mic coming down. Are
Thank
you were involved in high school musicals and singing and stuff? Do you still do kind of dramatic type of things? You've got got some authoritativeness in your voice, you know?
It's really funny, David. I was a theater guy, right? Musicals and acting and all that kind of stuff, and did that in college. And then I put it on hold for a long time, and I haven't been on stage until about 6 years ago when my wife encouraged me to audition for a theater show. And I was once again on the floorboards.
So, Michael, it's great to see you after all these years. Obviously, we're just seeing each other remotely, but you and I actually have a lot in common. We both graduated from Punahou School in Honolulu, Hawaii in 1988. In addition to that, you and I were both raised in the same church. We went to the same church in the Kahala neighborhood of Honolulu. And on top of all that, we were both pale, ginger-headed young men who were
Yep.
constantly being assaulted by the sun because we were raised in a tropical archipelago in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Exactly. And we suffered and benefited from all of the things that happened for people like us in that category. And our families are connected too for many, many years. And in fact, multiple generations are, but that I think that comes with being part of the island community as well, is that everybody knows everybody and we all go back in 16 different directions.
Well, just because we have this sort of shared upbringing, it doesn't mean I'm not going to ask you the hardball questions. So I hope you're preparing yourself.
I am ready to go. Lay it on me.
Okay, awesome. Well, let's start with your family. One of the reasons why I'm, interviewing all these people from my high school class is, years later, I just decided that I actually didn't know a thing about where some of these people that I knew pretty well, I didn't know a thing about their family backgrounds. Why were they in Hawaii? Who were their parents? I have a little bit of a better idea with you, but for the sake of our growing community of viewers, I'm gonna start with your family.
Right.
Let's start with the Sattlers. Actually, no, I know enough to ask about the Clowards first.
There you go.
Let's start with your mother's side of the family. Who are they?
Awesome. Yeah, my mother is Kathleen Cloward originally, and she was born and raised in Hawaii. Her father, Ralph Cloward, Dr. Cloward, as many people in Hawaii know him, has been there since the 20s. As a matter of fact, his father apparently went on a mission for the Mormon Church to Hawaii. He grew up in southern Utah, of all places, and my grandfather did. And when his father came to Hawaii on a mission, loved it so much, he moved his family out here. And my grandfather actually completed high school at McKinley and then went away to college and medical school, came back and became a practicing neurosurgeon from the late 30s all the way to his passing in the 90s. So my mom's side of the family goes back, a good century now in the Hawaii side of things. And my mom, when she went to college, went to the University of Utah, family roots, going there, and met my father, who grew up in Salt Lake City. And the two of them hit it off, came to Hawaii for their honeymoon, and then decided to take up station. So I was born and raised there in 1969.
If I remember correctly, your grandfather, the neurosurgeon, played a role during Pearl Harbor. Can you tell that story?
He was the only neurosurgeon in the entire Pacific Basin on December 7th, 1941. And so when the Japanese started to bomb Honolulu, he was in his house in Wailau Valley with my mom and her sister having breakfast Sunday morning, right? Time for breakfast. And they heard the planes flying overhead, and he got the phone call that said he was needed at Tripler Hospital, jumped in his car by himself with the bombs falling around him, drove himself all the way to Tripler Hospital, and started seeing soldiers from the bombings coming right into his operating room. He ended up operating, I think the story is that he operated for 3 or 4 days straight without sleep. necks, backs, brains, and saved a lot of lives. The interesting story about this is that his nurse, who was his absolute right hand and stayed with him to his death and beyond as his compatriot, was a Japanese American and got the same call he did to, get to the hospital. So here's my, white-skinned, ginger-headed, almost bald grandfather driving through the streets of Honolulu while the bombs are falling. And here's his Japanese American nurse driving through the streets of Honolulu as well. She was stopped 4 or 5 times before she got to Tripler. And thank goodness she made it, because he would not have been able to do all those operations without her. And he told that story throughout his entire life, that nothing really made him angrier than the way that his nurse had difficulty getting to Tripler on that day, because he literally says that there were soldiers whose lives were lost because it was she was as late as she was.
So both of your parents did have Utah roots ultimately, and that obviously is presumably from the Mormon migration to Utah. How far back do your Mormon roots go, and are there any sort of archival stories you can share?
Genealogy, which is very big in the Mormon church, as you know, was very big in our family. So we did all that research and all that back work on it. And it turns out my mother's side of the family has been in southern Utah since the 1840s. So I've got 5 generations of Mormons in my background from that side. And my father, his family, to the best of our understanding, was also LDS and ended up in the Salt Lake area in the early 20s, I think, having come over from Germany and Scandinavia as a result. So lots of Mormon roots that go back in the Salt Lake area and on my mom's side all the way back to the 19th century.
Well, that was a lucky break that your grandfather got sent to Hawaii on a mission, because that's a
pretty good place to end up.
Pretty good place to relocate.
Yeah.
So your mother's family was already there. Your father decided, probably without much persuasion, to come over and replant himself in Hawaii with the Cloward family. Because he was a professional in 1970s and 1980s Honolulu, did he dress in the classic professional man outfit of slacks with a Ren Spooner Hawaiian shirt on top of it?
That was absolutely de rigueur. It was required professional wear in downtown Honolulu. He was an attorney, so when he was in the courtroom, he had to put on a shirt, a coat, and tie, because the culture of mainland haoles, applied. And I remember very fondly, he had an office, downtown, and he would keep what he called his monkey suit, on a hanger behind the door. And anytime he had to go to court, he would pop on his jacket and tie, and the minute he was done with court, he would rip those things off and get back into the Ren Spooner. I remember very fondly, because Wailau at the time was under construction, and we were at they were building houses up this great big steep side of these mountains in southeast Oahu. And my upbringing was about running around in empty vacant lots and construction sites, and then getting on my bike and my mongoose bike and driving, riding down the hill at speed, and ending up down in, Kahala Mall and around Kahala School for baseball practices and those sorts of things. So that was our community growing up. It was I cannot imagine a better place and time to grow up, especially, interestingly, as a haole in Hawaii. I very, very seriously, believe that time in my life made me who I am. And then when I moved to the mainland much later, I retained a lot of the things that I learned about how to live and how to be among people. And to this day, I still think of myself as being from there. That's home. Even though I've lived now in Boston for 30 plus years, that part of the world and the way I was brought up in the 70s is fundamentally who I am, really.
We'll talk about the role that religion played in just the church community, because that was probably a big part of your parents' social life.
We had a little chapel that we went to right down there by Kahala Mall, the Kahala Ward Chapel, right next to the YMCA. And it was very much the social center of my family and mine, with the exception of I think second only to that in terms of community relationships. what's great about going to both Punahou and that church was that it was the same people every year. You sort of grew up with a cohort of folks, you among them, David. We shared many years in those halls. What was great about the church for me was that it gave me a set of role models who were, different than me. And the LDS Church in particular had a remarkably diverse background, even though it comes from possibly the whitest bread, white culture that America has to offer. We sang, Hawaiian songs when missionaries would leave the Kahala ward in order to go on missions to other places in the world. And the people and backgrounds of the individuals that I was associating with at all levels, adults, kids, etc., were from all different backgrounds. It took me many years to even realize that some of the people that I worked with, loved, hung out with, was friends with, went to school with, went to church with, were anything different. I didn't even think about them as, oh, that person was Japanese or that person was Hawaiian. It just literally never crossed my mind. And then I went back and went, wait a minute, I know that that's a Hawaiian last name. I guess she was Hawaiian. It literally did not occur to me until I got to the mainland that there were differences between us. Now, that said, we all teased each other about our ethnic backgrounds, but it was very lighthearted, and it was very, as I call it, skin deep, right? We had little opinions about each other, and Howleys were no exception. We were a minority just like anybody else was, and there were stories told about us, and they were mostly true. It doesn't matter at some level what your ethnicity was, anything else, because the way we grew up was just by being people. And I've always loved that about my upbringing. Treasure it.
As far as making fun of Howleys, you must be referring to the ethnic slur that we have bland food. But what we can talk about that later. I'm glad you mentioned Howley. Just how did you think about just being a Howley? What did that mean to you? And then now that you've been in Boston for decades, looking back, do you reinterpret your experience?
Howley meant foreigner, meant anybody who was from someplace other than Hawaii for when it was originally coined. But very quickly, it came to mean someone with white skin. And Howley in general, is used to describe people who represent, I think, given the American position in the islands, people from the mainland Hawaii. We call everybody from mainland United States the mainland, even though there were, mainland could have meant anything. That was what was meant. And Howleys were from the mainland. And I think what it meant to me growing up was there were negative connotations about how we were a little bit too formal, a little bit stuck up, a little stuffy, a little bit too rigid and kind of, posers. And that wasn't wrong. It was not off base. But what was very interesting was that, again, that's about as far as it went.
Because you were the member of a religion that is, let's call it a minority religion. It's not a mainstream Christian religion. There's quite a lot of people who think it's weird. Did you ever feel a little bit other because you knew that you were expected to believe sort of the superstructure of beliefs that was quite different from other people?
I think the answer is yes. And that, there's a little bit of nuance there, which is that as Hawaii went, it did not other LDS or Mormons as much. It was a fairly common thing in Hawaii for people to be part of that culture. I didn't feel any, if I'm being honest, negative connotations, from other Howleys, let alone other, people who of other backgrounds when I was growing up. It was just a thing. I did, however, feel a little bit, I felt more otherness about being Howley than I did about being LDS, right? There were certain places that, you couldn't go if you looked like us, or were not necessarily as welcome, etc. But I never felt that about being LDS. I never wore personally, I never wore my religion on my sleeve, but I never really made it part of who I was. It was just part of my background. I think as I became a teenager, I also, moved away from that even more so as a young kid, you do it because you have no choice. But once I got to be about 14, I said, maybe this isn't for me. Even though I still have always had a lot of respect for the church itself and a lot of the gospel, and as an adult and as a father, have had a couple of, revisits to the church for a variety of reasons. And it is part of me. It's part of how I was brought up and how I was raised and how I think about the world. And I still have a lot of respect for it.
I do have a memory of being in church, the church that we referenced in near the Kahala neighborhood. And I think we were in some sort of class, and I remember you voicing skepticism. You might have been about 14, 15. I was a little bit, in retrospect, I was impressed. But at the time, I was a little bit like, oh my God, Michael Sattler is like saying things you're not supposed to say. So was that, do you remember being sort of openly skeptical, and were there any repercussions for that?
It's funny. I date my skepticism about the church to about that age, 14, 15. So what you're probably remembering is a little bit of an evolution there. What's interesting is that my father, even though his background was in the church and his, for many generations, also thought of himself as a bit of a skeptic, and had always thought and trained me to be critical thinking and those sorts of things, all of which went very well with our Punahou backgrounds. But I remember turning those same thoughts onto some of the things that I was hearing, from a church perspective, and thinking that I was doing the right thing by, examining in that way. And to his credit, my father was extremely supportive. I actually, am pretty proud that my dad was able to support that, in me. I never went on a mission for the church, like a lot of people do when they turn 19. And that was regarded as a little bit of a departure as well within the culture. But my dad never made me think twice about that. So.
Thanks a lot letting me go, and you just kind of skirting the whole thing. Well done. But without getting too into the weeds of things that took place in our little church, I do think that this is something people will find interesting. There was a tradition within our little community church of going on these rather extreme outdoor adventures, going to places accessible by going over this like saddleback that doesn't really have a trail. You went on those trips. What are your memories from those trips? This was not like a North Face ad where everyone had this like beautiful equipment, and it was kind of like we kind of looked like we were refugees that had washed up on the shore of some unpopulated Hawaiian valley, and yet those are some of my most vivid memories.
David, I'll agree 100% with that. In a weird way, those experiences. So, the Mormon Church embraced the Boy Scouts of America from a very early point. It became really their youth auxiliary for boys. So we had a scouting program, and as part of scouting programs, you go on hikes and camps. Well, in Hawaii, hiking and camping means, finding places like this. And we were extremely lucky. They managed to get us into some of the most extremely fantastic, beautiful, and transcendent locations on the entire planet. And I mean transcendentally, both in terms of beauty and in terms of the spiritual dimension of it. You could feel when you went to some of these places how sacred and how holy they were. And it didn't matter what tradition we were really talking about. Remember, these were Mormons, but they were going to these places that were revered by ancient Hawaiians and had been ever since. And you could feel something that transcended all of those things.
Punahou High School, they called it the Academy. How do you think we'll get to the intellectual stuff, but how do you think you fit in socially?
I had the theater thing going, so people knew me a little bit because I'd been on stage and had done shows and those sorts of things.
With theater and, I guess, chorale kids, was that your general social circle?
That's an excellent question. As I recall, I had a bunch of friends who transcended, those groups, but my initial social group that I remember very fondly, we called ourselves the Rats after the hairband of the name in the 80s. And there was a bench right in the middle of campus. It was fun. That was one of the things that I loved about Punahou. I think it was Toby San Luis in was one of the speeches in our graduations, which was saying that Punahou was like a smorgasbord, and we got to pick a lot of different dishes.
Were there any classes or teachers that you kind of remember sort of like a light went on in your head that has stayed with you sort of throughout adulthood?
So many. I think Norm Henley's name pops immediately to mind. Norm Henley was our European studies and literature professor. He also did American literature. And so he was the one who made me really think about the idea of literature and poetry and those sorts of things in a completely different way. I think Doc Bowers was our math teacher for years and years. And I remember watching Doc Bowers teach math and go, I had never had so much fun in a math class in my entire life. I think Elizabeth Foster from the advanced writing world, boy, did she teach me a lot about writing. Harry Jalewski in the journalism department made a huge impression on me. I could go on and on.
You know, you're kind of have a bit of a thespian, you know, outgoing personality. Where do you think you got that from?
You know, I think I got it from both sides of the family. To your point, mom was an extrovert, loved people, loved being in front of people. She sang and she, you know, spoke very well and had no problem being out there. And I think I picked up a lot of my extroversion from her. I loved it. You know, it's one of those things where you start doing, I remember doing a play in summer school. I was the emperor in an Emperor's New Clothes play that was done. I must have been, what, 10? I don't know, something like that. And I just loved it. Loved theater all the way through. Loved musical theater. Did the Honolulu Boy Choir when I was little. That was what I wanted to do when I went to college, was be a actor, screenwriter, director. And that was going to be my entire path. Even before high school, I knew that was kind of where I wanted to be.
Describe your sort of moment of peak glory as far as performing in front of your classmates. My guess is Fiddler on the Roof.
We did a performance of Fiddler on the Roof. It was just an epic performance. And I was lucky enough to be cast as Tubby the Milkman, and they gave me a great big beard that I had to wear for all of that. And I ended up playing the husband to Sorona Soa, who was just an absolutely epic voice in our class. And the father to you know, Gabe Hammond and, you know, Jenny Cleve and a bunch of others who
I forgot that Gabby Hammond was your daughter.
Yeah, she was my daughter. I remember Gary Heidel, who was our choir director, saying, you know, like, one of the reasons why, you know, you got this part is because you look like a father, like a 50-year-old, you know, father of 3 teenage, you know, daughters.
And you were a 17-year-old at the time.
I was 17 at the time. I was like, how can you be saying that to me? But here I am 40 years later, and I kind of look like that same guy. So they were not kidding that, you know,
you grew into the role.
I grew into the role. In fact, I grew into the beard, and I have 2 daughters of my own who are exactly in that same classification. So there was definitely something foreshadowing about my involvement in that show. And a lot of people keep bringing that moment up. You know, that's their memory of me when I go back to Hawaii. A lot of people still remember that of me, which I am super grateful for. And it was wonderful.
Speaking of Gentiles, and the reason I say that word is because in the Mormon church, they call non-Mormons Gentiles. Oh. Interestingly, you were a relatively active member of the church while you were in high school. Did you go to parties? Did you drink? As someone who's supposed to comply with certain rules, but there are all these things that Satan wanted you to do.
Yeah, you know, it's an excellent question, David, and I think a really interesting one. I kind of designed a personality for myself as a especially in high school, as not part of the church. I didn't think of myself in that way. I didn't identify that way, and yet I was not a drinker, and I was not a consumer of other herbs that were, you know, popular on campus at the time. But I think that there was something that was deeply seated in me that made me say, I don't want to lose the control that comes with being, you know, that person. I was the designated driver. I was the, you know, the guy who people knew was not going to be in trouble, you know, when things got out of hand at a Greg Thielen party, you know, on the beach in Lanikai. There was a little bit of being other, you know, that went along with that. But in retrospect, I actually kind of like it about myself.
Since you were a sober person at these gatherings, what are some memories? Like what were some of the rituals? You know, put it through an anthropological lens of what you observed during these high school parties in 1980s Hawaii.
So I remember making journeys to some of the clubs that would allow 18-year-olds or 17, 16-year-olds, if you weren't asking too many questions, to come in. I remember the club cigarette thing became like a real thing. I remember that there were always, you would go to a house party, and every once in a while there would be a back room or a garage that was sort of off limits unless you were invited, and there was something else going on back there. And what I loved the most was the diversity of the different points of view, that would always come in. There were always people coming in and out of parties that I would go to that you would not necessarily think were the people that you would hang out with during the day. But when we would go out, we were all together, and it was wonderful. And I remember very fondly all those times. I left with a smile on my face, ready to be off to something new and ready to leave home. And as I grew older after that, I started to realize how much I missed the place. And even to this day, I still go back and think to myself, this is probably where I belong at some level. And again, this is where I am now. So you got to make it work.
Boston's not so bad.
Boston's not so bad.
It's probably the second best city on the East Coast.
I call it 2/3 of New York, David. 2/3 of the good and 2/3 of the bad. Let's go with that.
Well, thanks, Michael Sattler. I've really enjoyed speaking to you.
It's so great to chat with you, David, and such great questions. I can't wait to hear the rest of what you're doing in your series, and I really congratulate you for doing this. This is some epic stuff. Good work.
Thank you.